to the responsibility to protect.
On atrocity prevention.
Word kill.
All societies are potentially vulnerable.
Atrocity crimes.
Timely and appropriate action.
Welcome to Expert Voices on Atrocity Prevention by the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect. I'm Jacqueline Streitfeld Hall, Deputy Executive Director at the Global Center. This podcast features one-on-one conversations with practitioners from the fields of human rights, conflict prevention, and atrocity prevention. These conversations will give us a glimpse of the personal and professional side of how practitioners approach human rights protection and atrocity prevention, allowing us to explore challenges, identify best practices, and share lessons learned on how we can protect populations more effectively. Today we are recording a special episode on the situation in Venezuela. I'm joined by Feliciano Reyna, a human rights defender and humanitarian actor from Venezuela who is the founder and executive director of Acción Solidaria, and Elisabeth Pramendorfer, Geneva director and Venezuela expert at the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect. Feliciano, you established Acción Solidaria more than 30 years ago. Can you share more about your own story and what first drew you into human rights and humanitarian work, and how that work has evolved as Venezuela's crisis has deepened?
Thank you very much, Jacqueline. We started at a time when there was absolute silence around HIV and AIDS. Actually, what was said around the world, I had gone to my first international conference in Geneva, and the motto was silence equals death. And what we had seen by that time, this was 98, were many deaths, surrounded by silence, among them my own partner in 95. So this is what gave birth to Acción Solidaria, given that also there had been some very important scientific advances in terms of treatment, and they were becoming available in Western Europe, the US, and Canada, not yet in Venezuela. So we established this mechanism to support people with treatments, from sort of this bridge of volunteers between Venezuela and, Caracas and Miami. And then, as time went by, of this very specific and sort of small service in a way, we were able to support almost 300 people. Then it was clear that there was much more to do, again, in this environment of silence equals death. And, that brought us more into looking at the health of individuals affected by HIV, and that silence and discrimination and stigmatization. And then at some point in doing a protest with others who were affected by lack of treatments in around 2002, 2003, it was clear that our aim was not just to support people affected by health issues, but we had to do it from a human rights perspective, the right to health as part of the right to life. So that's what brought Acción Solidaria into the realm of human rights, and then working as well with a Venezuelan network of civil society organizations. I was chosen as its president at some point, elected, and then we started working more on other issues of human rights, such as civil society rights, freedom of association, assembly, expression, and so on. So this is kind of the trip until, to make it much shorter now, in 2016, when we were facing this very, very dire situation for people in terms of health, education, access to food, and so on. It's when we became a humanitarian actor as well, and we established a national program to support people with health needs, particularly.
Amazing. And, how has that evolved amidst the current crisis?
Well, it became more and more difficult as because what happened, and we were probably the first with a couple of colleagues to call attention to international bodies in regards to the humanitarian situation in Venezuela, which was actually very clearly described in literature since the 2000 around, what was called a complex humanitarian emergency. So it was like multidimensional and so complex that it needed international support. So it was something that went beyond the resources and possibilities of where they happen. This is either in Venezuela or whatever else. In general, they appear after, let's say, some natural disasters or uh, armed conflict inside a country or a region. In the case of Venezuela, it was developed, along a few years in which corruption played an amazing role as well, the erosion of the rule of law, how institutions started, ceasing to respond to the needs of people, to protect people in the rights to all sorts of, again, of situations, not only social rights, environmental rights, and of course the rights to fair trial, for example, the right to personal freedom, and it became so harsh that then we made that turn and decided to work in also providing some relief to people affected by the complex humanitarian emergency. At some point, this was 2016. The UN agencies on the ground were not responding. We had to send a very strong letter rejecting that conduct to Ban Ki-moon, then Secretary General. And fortunately, again, he recognized the humanitarian crisis, and very slowly, then 17, 18, then things started changing until what we have today, which is a system in which there is what is called a humanitarian architecture on the ground that coordinates with local civil society in implementing humanitarian programs, but also, and this is thanks to the call of attention by the ex High Commissioner for Human Rights Zaid Al Hussein, who said in a report in 2018 that the situation of arbitrary arrests, extrajudicial executions, cases of torture deserved the naming of a commission of inquiry, because what he was seeing, were situations that may amount to crimes against humanity. And so at that point, then many of us, colleagues in human rights, sort of with the two hats, working on the humanitarian situation, but as well in our role in the area of human rights, we worked and advocated for the creation of such a mechanism that ended up being the fact-finding mission on Venezuela. It was a different standard of proof, but it was very important to have them, and they have been doing a very thorough, rigorous, and serious job in documenting those situations that Zaid Al Hussein had called attention to.
Elisabeth, can you describe how the Global Center first began engaging on Venezuela and also give a little background on your experience working with Venezuelan colleagues like Feliciano over the past decade?
We at the Global Center, we first started to formally work on Venezuela. It was in late spring 2018. At that point, we received some first really comprehensive analysis on the Commission of Potential Crimes Against Humanity, which came at that point from the Inter-American system. This was, as Feli mentioned before, we had UN investigations, but we had a very strong report that was mandated by an OAS panel of experts. And this, of course, came alongside years of incredible rigorous documentation by Venezuelan civil society. And so over these first months in 2018, we started to really begin our monitoring and research. So we tried to really understand what are the root causes, what are the structural risk factors, who are the perpetrators, what is motivating the violence, but also, as Feliciano has explained, what has enabled the crisis to become so deeply entrenched over time. And so fast forward, a few months to, it was early summer 2019. I was in New York just for a week in our New York office to spend some time with our colleagues. And it happened to be by coincidence the same time that Feli and Beatriz Borges, another dear friend and incredible human rights defender who has also been on our podcast, were in New York for meeting with UN member states, and it was Crisis Action that convened a civil society roundtable with Feli and Bibi, and it was the first time I met both of them in person. I had, of course, heard of them and known them by following their work, but that was when we met. And I do remember this so clearly, and I still joke with Feli about this because the entire room was full of civil society colleagues. We were all so excited to be there. And Feliciano walks in. He was wearing a tie, which is very unusual for him. And he comes in, he takes a deep breath, he sits down and he says something like, well, now that we're amongst civil society, I can relax. And he loosened his tie, and instantly, he just, the room softened. He completely broke the ice, and everyone adored him immediately, including myself, of course. And I'll always remember that moment. But after that, we just stayed in really close touch. And as Feli had mentioned, at that point, conversations had started around, concretely calling for the establishment of a commission of inquiry at the UN Human Rights Council. And so over that summer, there was an extensive amount of advocacy that Venezuelan colleagues and international and regional partner organizations, put in, where we pushed for the adoption of such a resolution at the HRC. And within a few weeks, over that summer period, we actually managed to get a group of Latin American countries and Canada to introduce and to lead on a resolution, which, as Feli mentioned, would become the fact-finding mission of Venezuela. And this was such an absolutely profound, moment, I think, for all of us as a community, And it was the first UN investigative mechanism for a crisis in Latin America. And it is still operating today. It continues to investigate, collect evidence, report to the Human Rights Council. And it has been, as Feli mentioned, so instrumental really on keeping attention on Venezuela, especially now in a post-3rd January context. But again, on a more personal level, that was really the summer that I think marked the beginning for so many deep and meaningful relationships that shape our work today with Venezuelan colleagues. And Feli in particular has become such a dear friend and someone that, I trust deeply, and where we know each other's, partners and families. And, it's just a wonderful friendship, and we try to see each other wherever that is in the world, in Geneva, in Madrid, in Caracas. And I think that's those kind of relationships, they're a gift, and I think that's what also makes this work so wonderful and deeply meaningful.
Feliciano, from your perspective inside the country, you mentioned the multidimensional nature of the crisis. How did you experience the changes and the impact of the gradual erosion of the rule of law over the past 3 decades, kind of in the subsequent dramatic economic collapse and systematic repression? Because there was a shift from, even in how you spoke about it, from a kind of humanitarian crisis to, a few years later, you find a need to push for a human rights council mechanism. And what was that like for populations?
Sure. It was, such an unexpected ride, because when we started, we just felt that we were going to work for, people with HIV and provide treatment, and then get involved perhaps in prevention with campaigns and so on, and be a part of a global community of people doing work on the area of HIV and AIDS. Uh, and then there were some very important political changes in Venezuela, a change of system in a way, when Hugo Chavez was elected president. And in the beginnings, the first years of his presidency, we had a very sort of natural relationship with the health ministry, for example. His first health minister, second, I went with her as part of the Venezuelan delegation to the first UN special session on HIV and AIDS in 2001. So, we did have engagement, and it was possible to work as well in public policy and put the issues on the table without retaliation, without fears of reprisals of any type. And as time went by, but one would have to go down memory lane, looking at many different moments in which, say, the political lines were broken, and then they had an impact in other areas. There was a coup attempt in 2002 against Chavez. Then there was a strike in the oil sector that stopped, the industry. And so it was this sort of infighting, more in the political arena, perhaps even economic, that started impacting then, the social arena, let's say. As well, we saw perhaps as attempts to even change the Venezuelan constitution. This is 2007, um, and even before then, and this is what brought me to the area of the right to freedom of association. There was an attempt to pass legislation based on the Russian law on foreign agents, and naming organizations as foreign agents, and starting to put all these limitations on our work. So, the whole system started slowly closing in, not only in the political arena, but also in other areas as well. And this started affecting, of course, civil society. Then again, the attempt to change the constitution, we advocated strongly against it, and it was very successful. Let's say that advocacy by many actors, and that started, brought the situation even to more pressures. So, it was something again that started developing that we would never have imagined that they would take the shape that they took. In the first protest that became more massive later on, this is 2013, 14, and on, then we saw conduct by law enforcement agencies and other actors, sort of para-state actors, that were, to us, again, something that we had never faced, never thought we would be facing. And in fact, in 2013, in just 3 states of the country, and this was recorded documented by some of our colleagues, we saw practices that then in 2014 became national, which were, these arbitrary arrests, torture, and ill treatment, and some disappearances as well, even for short term. So it was a slow process, but that was, a product of confrontations, probably more in the political arena, that then had this very strong impact everywhere else. And it was a time as well, that 2013, 14, when our economy started becoming, like one of so much destitution for people. Our internal product went from 400 billion a year in 8 years to only 40 billion a year. So it dropped almost 90%. Imagine the impact on the Venezuelan population, what that meant. And a good part of that was due to corruption, mismanagement, and again, what even brought us to realize that we had passed, say, the threshold of some human rights affected, to a generalized situation, structural situation of human rights violations, were our reports to the Universal Periodic Review in 2015-16, and then to the Committees on Human Rights and Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And then, so that was sort of, part of a long road towards, again, where, as Ellie was saying, where we had the fortune to cross our paths and find mechanisms to have these situations, very complex, difficult, again, multidimensional, documented and then brought to the attention of not only the human rights mechanisms, such as at the Inter-American Commission and the Human Rights Council fact-finding mission, but then those documentations and allowed us as well to bring in other actors, more in the political, diplomatic, and other spaces where we could speak about what was happening in Venezuela and then try to offset the effects, particularly on people, in large numbers of people affected by this situation.
I think, Feli, what you are just saying is so illustrative of something that we in atrocity prevention, and with regards to the majority of the crisis situations we cover all around the world, we try to emphasize over and over and over, which is that atrocity crimes don't happen overnight, right? So we saw the early warning signs under Chavez with regards to attacks on judicial independence and on democratic checks and balances and on shrinking civic space, pressure on independent media, starting, to see harassment of political opponents, human rights defenders. And then really once, the situation in Venezuela caught the attention of international media, 2013, 2014, with the protests, it wasn't a rupture. It was really just an acceleration, and all of the repressive tools had already been in place. And we saw the rapid mobilization and intensification. And I think that that's such a critical point that we always try to kind of bring across when we talk about the root causes and the warning signs, and how atrocity crimes kind of develop and the enabling factors develop over a longer period of time.
It really, again, Ellie, I think this is really important. It raises a question of how to really pay attention to those early warning signs and what to do when they start showing up. Because unfortunately, and I saw that and I learned with you and through the Global Center for R2P, that R2P didn't mean that you see a situation that is disruptive and is affecting people and then you immediately do a military intervention, which has something that some people in Venezuela, perhaps many, even very irresponsibly, were saying, well, we need to activate R2P. And it's like, well, what are you talking about? But then, the challenge there is then to work through those early warnings, to prevent precisely to have to resort to some sort of practices that we really don't want and we reject, and such as what happened actually in Venezuela on January 3rd. It was a breach of international law, and for some it was a celebration. It was like, oh, finally, R2P, and it's very frustrating, but there must be ways to be able to react, for the international community and other actors, of course, and to prevent, such things from happening, because they may lead to much worse situations, actually.
Feliciano, what, if anything, has fundamentally changed since the US came in at the beginning of January and removed President Maduro? They obviously removed the head of the repressive apparatus, but haven't really addressed the deep structural problems.
Well, it's been interesting because what happened was, again, quite quite a harsh event, but you haven't seen many reactions inside Venezuela where, people would come out and then somehow reject or celebrate what happened and so on. There's a lot of expectation. I think that the explanation we saw perhaps abroad more of some people, in different countries and so on, celebrating, others, of course, rejecting. But at the end, I think what's important, and it's what has been my sense with the Venezuelans in Venezuela, it's expectation. Is say, okay, this happened. This is something that we would have not expected. Now, what do we do with this? Because in fact, we are exactly as we were before. Towards the end of the year, the economy was really crumbling. And this was also due to those blockades of oil ships. It was due as well to sanctions. And so whatever the reasons, and I can also speak about, some of the things that I was really concerned about, the narrative of Nicaragua, the narrative of Venezuela being a major drug dealer, and all of that somehow, it made me remember the weapons of mass destruction narrative. But then again, the situation was very difficult. The expectations for the economy starting 2026 were really bad, and people were like saying, well, so where does this go to? We have had an exchange rate, this sort of market in which, so the bolivar had started being worth 50 no sorry $65 at the beginning of 2025. 65. By the end of 25, it was around 345, and in the black market it was close to 500. So again, there was this sense of insecurity. It's like, so where does this go? What happens if oil does not come to Venezuela? What happens if we would not have gasoline? There are communities that go for a month or more without running water, so they have to go and see where they find it in trucks and then pay for trucks, and there's not that much money. Poverty is up to 78% of the population. So again, there was expectation. There is still expectation. It's barely today, I think, 4 weeks. So what happens now? How do we work to make this more of an opportunity to build, to create the conditions for, an improvement in people's lives, at the same time that some very deep rooted problems in terms of, breaches of the constitution, lack of the rule of law, political and prisoners for other reasons beyond political reasons, uh, a closed civic space where, public deliberation and participation had been repressed. Would it be possible then to work towards changing those conditions? What do we need to do? So I think that there is a lot of expectation, uncertainty for sure. You have another actor that is sort of intervening and saying what has to be or not to be done, and so that adds a lot to that uncertainty. But there is, I think, an expectation that in a way has some rays of hope. And I hope that we raise to that challenge and are able, in spite of all the difficulties, to create something appropriated by the Venezuelans, owned by the Venezuelans, to move forward somehow, and sort of start leaving behind some really terrible practices that have affected the Venezuelan population.
Thank you for that, Feliciano. And I think ending on that note of kind of the very real hope, Elizabeth, the removal of Maduro has fueled hopes of change. Um, but we also know there are still risks and challenges ahead. So can you talk a little about why it's so important to distinguish kind of that space between the fall of an individual and the persistence of the entrenched repressive system, and sort of build on where Feliciano left off in terms of what needs to happen next?
Yeah, thank you, Jackie. And before answering your question, I would love, if I can, just to quickly touch upon what Feli mentioned in terms of the conversations around how R2P applies and how these conversations have kind of come up again in a 3rd January context, because we, from our side, spent most of 2019, 2020, 2021, exactly as Feli mentioned, explaining that R2P does not equal military intervention and that it is not regime change and just taking one person and putting someone else in charge in Miraflores. So I just really want to emphasize, we've done this over and over and we have so many publications out there, but maybe this podcast is a great opportunity to clarify again how, as Feli mentioned, 3rd January didn't happen in isolation. We saw months of military tensions between the US and Caracas rising. It led to dozens of extrajudicial executions in the Caribbean Sea. But what we also saw in response is that actually Venezuelan authorities utilized and instrumentalized also those tensions, for example, to put in place emergency powers. Or we've also received information from the fact-finding mission that it intensified the coercive enlistment of civilians into Bolivarian militias. And this actually shows you how rapidly military tensions, not even military action, but just the tensions, have increased protection risks, and really leaving that uncertainty of what's coming next. And of course, 3rd January is a flagrant violation of the UN Charter. It sets an extremely dangerous precedent that geopolitical super bullies can just, maneuver themselves through the world by force. But again, it has also that narrative by the US, to frame it in the context of, economic gains and getting resources. It really showed you that danger of instrumentalizing crises in a way that completely disregard civilian protection and democratization and human rights. And really leave it up to those power calculations. And I think that R2P, and we've emphasized this over and over again, it demands exactly the opposite approach. It calls for responses, and that goes to your question, Jackie, of what needs to happen now, that are based and grounded in a very context-specific analysis of where the risks are coming from, the root causes, perpetrator behavior, but also mitigating factors. And how we make sure that international response is based and anchored in human rights and civilian protection and accountability, and really providing that path forward that has, Venezuelans and their dignity and their safety and their well-being always as the top priority. But Jackie, perhaps just to answer your actual question that you asked me at the beginning in terms of the difference between, removing an individual and kind of being left with that entrenched repressive system. I do want to say that something we've been trying to emphasize since the moment that we've publicly responded to 3rd January. We put out a statement on 6th January. If you haven't read it yet, I would encourage everyone to have a look, because something that was really, really important for us, in addition to calling out unlawful US military action, was to, as Feliciano mentioned, really recognize and give respect to that weight of that moment, because for many Venezuelans, seeing Nicolás Maduro and his wife, Cilia, who, by the way, is not just his wife, she's a key political figure in Chavismo, and seeing them, removed from power, transferred to the US, this was the closest that they have felt to some type of justice in a very long time. And I think that really matters, because if you look at the past decade alone, and Feliciano has taken us back even further than that, but what we have seen just in the past years, we have seen so many cycles of international pressure and mediation and accountability and sanctions and the recognition of interim governments and multiple electoral moments. But the one constant that remained throughout that entire time was the ruling elite. It was that repressive state system with Maduro at the top. So that moment did carry profound emotional significance. And it was a moment that we really did not want to dismiss, and we wanted to give space and acknowledge. But yes, removing Nicolás Maduro did not undo the systems and the institutions and the structures that were deliberately constructed and sustained over such a long time to maintain power through repression. And we've, spoken about that many times, and we have a lot of analysis out there since 3rd January. But of course, the same core figures Senior officials continue at this moment in time to occupy positions of authority, and this goes across executive, legislative, defense, interior, security systems. And this also includes, and this is important to keep in mind for atrocity risks, it includes hardline actors that have designed, political persecution and repression. We've had UN investigations that have documented how individual, senior figures go as far as to selecting specific individuals and providing names to intelligence services of who needs to be detained and who needs to be tortured. We've seen, state-led media being mobilized to target political opponents. And these individuals that remain in place today have also maintained influence over, non-state actors or armed civilian groups, like Feliciano mentioned, the colectivos, that are used to extend that social control and repression element beyond the formal state structures. And then, of course, in addition to these individuals, also there are all these structures and the institutions that, again, over so many years have been instrumentalized to facilitate atrocity crimes that at this point remain in place. And just to give you a sense of the complexity and how far-reaching these institutions are entrenched, it is important to note that even these different institutions have been put in charge for different types of repression, right? So in the context of political repression or persecution, what we see is, for example, the intelligence organs, the SEBIN, the Bolivarian National Intelligence Service, and the DGCIM, which is the military counterintelligence. But then when you look at what happened during protests and violations that happened during national protests, but also in the context of security or social control operations, it's the National Guard, it's the Bolivarian National Armed Forces, it's the CSAPC, which is the Criminal Investigations Courts. So this just signals you that it will require full reform and really dismantling and holding to account these institutions and individuals and the chains of command. And that reform also has to address the judicial system, the Attorney General's office, prosecutorial judicial actors that have actively enabled repression, right? And so this is why this distinction between one individual and the system really matters, because the architecture of repression, the chains of command and the institutions remain in place. And without dismantling that architecture, the conditions that made those crimes possible, as Feliciano has explained, haven't necessarily changed. But again, I'm going to end up here by saying that this is precisely why this moment right now provides such an absolutely critical opportunity to push and to pressure and to insist on those far-reaching institutional changes.
Thank you, Elisabeth. And, to turn back to Feliciano, as a person who has already had to navigate immense, personal risks to your organization amidst the pressure of working in a repressive environment, where do you see openings to reduce harm, reopen space for civil society, and advance a path towards democratic change?
Well, one thing that I have, spoken about with colleagues with experience in situations of conflict is that you would want to have space for these critical very structural changes that are needed in order to protect the people, guarantee rights, and so on. But there are previous steps, probably, in some areas in which it would be possible. It has been possible in their experience when I've shared with them within the humanitarian arena, mostly, is that there are, when you start having this sort of engagement with those who have been involved in these kinds of situations of repression and other, much more uh, uh, of much more gravity, is that perhaps what can bring all together are issues dealing with the daily lives of people. And this is employment. And so we have power shortages, water shortages, lack of units for transportation, which actually prevents kids sometimes from going to school. There are millions of kids out of the school system from 5 years old to 17. The infrastructure, the school infrastructure, is in a shambles. We still have in our public health system 72% of medical personnel and nursing personnel have left to the private sector or abroad. We still have some 3 million people wanting to leave Venezuela because the conditions are not proper to have a life of dignity. This was before what happened. So I think that, in one major issue we had was the lack of information, of knowing, having accurate information of what is happening on the ground. So among Venezuelan organizations, we have worked in gathering information from the ground, for example, in a humanitarian platform. And we have been conducting since 21 until last year household surveys. So, what I'm trying to say is that we have a wealth of information there that we can share if if we are heard, and we hope to be heard, and say, okay, we have these issues that are really serious. Uh, of course, we have to sort of transit the path towards justice, but can we agree on some things that need to be fixed today urgently, and move towards that ideal that we would like to see in the years to come? For example, and this is something that I've been stressing in the latest meetings, and I did when you invited me just a few days ago, is that, of course, releasing those imprisoned arbitrarily without any due process and without any guarantees and being kept in the worst conditions, they have to be out. Not only so, but hopefully very soon, they have to have their cases dropped. So that's one thing that is urgent. And I think that, in any situation, it probably is agreed that this is one step that opens up possibilities. The second one that I have been calling for is an opening of the civic space, a space for deliberation, for public debate, for putting on the table, those issues that are affecting us as a society. I know that there would be the temptation to say today, okay, what I want to put on the table is that such and such and such and such person must pay and, let's say, go to jail. That will not, again, perhaps create the possibilities of continuing to advance in opening up, first to solve issues that have to do with the stability of the situation, and then because you cannot forget those issues of justice. They are there, but they may not happen immediately, particularly because those in power still are in power, and those mechanisms and those structures, as Elisabeth was saying, are still in place. So, again, can we agree on solving some of those issues of need for the people? Can we agree on perhaps restructuring, the whole electricity infrastructure, the school infrastructure, the health infrastructure? It might take time, but since we're talking about resources that will be going into the country, resources that can be used through, let's say, even the humanitarian architecture of the UN and so on, I think that there are possibilities for that. And in these days, I have been, in reading about the transition processes, and there's one really important lesson, I'd say, of course, being different the situation, but in Spain, in this fantastic book by Javier Cercas, which is called Anatomy of an Instant, he describes what led to the coup in 1981 in February in Spain, to try to sort of, dismantle what had been built very, very carefully after the death of the dictator Franco. And in part of his book, and I was reading this to some colleagues yesterday from Caracas, He says it was a pact of remembrance. It wasn't a pact of forgetfulness. It was a pact of remembrance. But what he explains then is that remembering what had happened and all the consequences of the civil war of 3 years and then the many years of dictatorship, we have to act differently in order not to dismantle what we're building very carefully. And of course, what happened happened, and it has been recorded, and justice must take place. But we have to transit this very tricky road, not forgetting, but remember that we cannot go back to the effects of a million people killed because of the civil war. So again, this is why I'm sort of, saying that it should be possible. It takes a lot of wisdom, a lot of care, and particularly keeping in mind that behind or perhaps in front of whatever we do, whatever responsibilities we take, are millions of people in poverty, in extreme poverty, kids out of school, and we have to be able to build this very carefully so that, perhaps not in 6 months or a year, but we start seeing a light. And this is something that we are getting also from people on the ground. They need change. They need some, start living better.
Absolutely. Elisabeth, you've talked about R2P already a bit, but from a responsibility to protect perspective, given everything Feliciano just said, what should the international community prioritize right now to help in reducing harm, supporting Venezuelans and what they actually need, helping the country move on a path towards human rights, civilian protection, democratic change, and so forth?
Yeah, thank you, Jackie. I think that, as Feliciano mentioned, any discussion of what states should do now in their individual capacity at a regional level, multilaterally, it has to start and end with what Venezuelans themselves have identified as the most urgent priorities in terms of protection, immediate protection, and also dignity, a path towards democratic change, right? And I think Feli has outlined that so wonderfully, what has been so obvious in terms of what the immediate priorities right now are is the situation of political prisoners and more broadly, of all individuals that have been arbitrarily detained. Because arbitrary detention, you have to imagine this has been such an absolutely central element of crimes against humanity in Venezuela. It has oftentimes been accompanied by, enforced disappearances, or at least short-term enforced disappearances. And in many cases, even today, for some individuals that we know are in state custody, we still don't know where they are. Families don't yet know where they are. And over all these years, and especially, also since 3rd January, there's incredible Venezuelan civil society organizations, Foro Penal, Justicia, Encuentro y Perdón, who have carried out just incredible work under immense pressure, documenting these cases and trying to verify numbers and supporting families. And just to give you a sense of that magnitude and the scale of that issue that Feliciano pointed to, as of, I think it's 30th of December last year, we were looking at around 1,000 political prisoners. This is a number from Justicia, Encuentro y Perdón. And this is only the number that colleagues were able to verify. What we have seen since 3rd January is that, as we have always expected, this number actually is expected to be much higher because many families, out of fear, didn't come forward to report the detention of their loved ones. And so what we've seen since early January, I think it speaks so well to, I think, what Feli, really described as that mix of emotions of immense hope and fear and kind of uncertainty of what's going to happen, because we've seen, announcements that from state authorities that, a large amount of people will be released and we're turning a page. And then at the same time, that process has taken place with extremely limited transparency, and it has caused extreme, immense distress and re-traumatization for families and for individuals that are still detained, and also those that have been released. And I do want to emphasize here, in terms of what states need to do, precisely that point that Feliciano mentioned, which is that even the individuals that so far have been excarcerated, and I just checked the numbers, I think Foro Penal as of 2 days ago counted 306 individuals. Many of them are not free. They are still under criminal investigation. They are still subject to restrictive measures. They cannot leave the country. They cannot talk publicly about their detention. And so this really opened that door of what we call, that revolving door of arbitrary detention that we know now the government can use, at its disposal to maintain, social order, maintain fear, and kind of keep that repression going. And this has to be a top priority for member states going forward, to relentlessly and in a very principled manner really push authorities and use wherever they have leverage with Venezuelan authorities to ensure that all individuals that are arbitrarily detained have their charges dropped and are released. And I think the point that Feliciano made precisely, in the context of political prisoners, is that obviously we are in this on the long run. The structural reforms and that path towards democracy, this is not a quick fix, and this is not an immediate measure that is going to be solved overnight. But these things, pushing for the release of those that are arbitrarily detained, this is a very immediate step that the international community can take right now to set clear their demands also towards Venezuelan authorities going forward. And then, of course, humanitarian relief. Philippe spoke about that in great detail, which has to really be the focus now of the international community. And I just want to add here, as a last point, support for civil society organizations. It is Venezuelan colleagues that throughout this entire crisis have been on the front lines, and in a lot of situations they have been the only ones that have documented the situation on the ground. They have supported victims' families, and they have provided life-saving assistance, like Acción Solidaria, and they do this at incredible, enormous risks. And so the very immediate step that the international community and governments can take is obviously ensure financial support for these organizations, but also make sure that whatever decisions are made now in capitals around the world on how to engage with Venezuelan authorities, that it is the voice and the analysis and the expertise of Venezuelan civil society that is part of technical and political decision-making processes going forward.
I want to build on that, turn to Feliciano to have maybe the final word in the conversation. But, as someone who has, through the years worked so hard to engage the international community, first, as you noted, on HIV, and more recently on human rights and the multidimensional crisis in Venezuela, you've experienced firsthand the benefits of a system that actively listens to you, and you've also experienced the challenges of the roadblocks within multilateral advocacy. So, from your perspective, what does it practically mean to ensure that Venezuela's future is determined by Venezuelans themselves? And how can international actors avoid sidelining Venezuelan voices in this critical moment?
That's quite a challenge, Jacqueline. Thank you for mentioning this, because it's a huge concern. Um, because before what happened on January 3rd, perhaps this was being somehow the process, say, from the human rights perspective, humanitarian, labor unions, the political actors, business actors were sort of, the ones mobilizing whatever connections, resources, spaces were to act, on our own, let's say, and having all of these external pressures, mostly from one actor, which is the US. Because even when one thinks about, for example, measures like sanctions, individual sanctions, those were imposed by Europe, Canada, but not the general sanctions as had been imposed by the U.S. Then we saw what happened in the Caribbean, the operations and the bombardments and so on, and then so now it's a different, again, it's a different situation where the risk is that, as it had been done, and for many of us wrongly, and doing a lot of harm to the Venezuelan people, exacerbating um, a situation that had been created internally by the Venezuelan government, but it was exacerbated by these general sectorial oil sanctions, right? So how do we go now forward in saying yes, but this support first, hopefully, and this is part of our advocacy, will be multilateral. It is not in anyone's, I think, interest that we have now one sort of guardian that says what happens or doesn't in Venezuela. Um, and particularly because then you become, as a country and as a people, part of an internal agenda, an internal agenda of interests, economic mostly. So I think it is a huge challenge what you're saying, and I think, in a way, the way in which we're able to move through this very challenging context will determine, if we really bring it back to us. And this has one very important actor, which is, those in power today. There must be an opening. I was also reading, if uh, I'm sure that all the pressure of Mandela and everyone around him was really important, but there was one de Klerk that somehow, as well, sort of eased away in it. Of course, there are many considerations, but I think it would be important for it to be internal, then, that we see different actors as well contributing to that possibility of bringing this conflict to inside Venezuela with support from abroad, but hopefully, again, multilateral. It's our region to begin with, Brazil, Colombia, our neighbors, and others, Caribbean, as well as Europe for sure, and other actors who have been there at other times, even at the Human Rights Council, Japan, South Korea, and so on. So, Canada, of course. Um, so, but again, it means I don't know how to say it in Spanish. It's grandeza, no? It's like uh, having this idea that this is not going to be a win-lose situation. Everybody has to give something and perhaps lose something. And this then also has to do with the, say, leading opposition group nowadays, which is headed by Maria Corina Machado. It will take a lot of compromising, a lot of putting personal um, interests, for power and so on the side, at least temporarily. I think that's very important. But I hope that we're able to do that. I don't have an answer today. Uh, Advocacy will take us probably to U.S. Congress, U.S. Senate, other actors in the U.S. with our partners in civil society. I think that one of the things that has been most amazing to me, again, is in our dealings and advocacy at the Human Rights Council, the Inter-American Commission, is the absolute wonderful people that we have in civil society as partners. And I'm mentioning you, Eli, Jacqueline, the Global Center for R2P, and many others, ISHR, Amnesty, Ebola, and so on. So, but again, I think that it's a tricky road. But I do hope that we're able to, again, bring everything back uh, to Venezuela internally, and that those who support what is happening can do so, but understanding, the let's say the leadership, the ownership of Venezuelan people, organizations, parties, recognizing diversity, opening dialogue with all actors, and knowing that this is for, again, just for the good of Venezuela. Huge challenge. Very hard to answer, Jack.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Expert Voices on Atrocity Prevention. If you enjoyed this episode, we encourage you to subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, SoundCloud, or Spotify, and we'd be grateful if you left us a review. For more information on the Global Center's work on R2P, mass atrocity prevention, and populations at risk of mass atrocities, visit our website at www.globalr2p.org and connect with us on Facebook, Blue Sky, or LinkedIn at GCR2P.